Good afternoon. My name is Ernest Simon, and I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with the Kindertransport. But before I do that, I'd like to deal with a little bit of history. And to help me, I'd like you to try to imagine that you are Jews living in Berlin in the 1930s. Bear in mind that the Nazi Party had come into power in 1933, that the Nuremberg laws had been passed in 1935. These laws deprived Jews of German citizenship and began a series of very evil persecutions. These were blood protection laws designed to protect the so-called purity of the Aryan race, forbidding marriage or sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German blood. Passports and ID cards were stamped with the letter J, and each Jew was compelled to adopt an additional name, Isaac for men and Sarah for women. Jews lost their jobs. Jewish children were excluded from schools or relegated to a very much a second or third class status. Cinemas, theaters, clubs, sports facilities all became off limits for Jews. Gangs roamed the streets and casually beat up any passing Jews. The result was that the Jewish population of Germany, and after March 1938, the Jews of Austria also, desperately started to look for ways and means of leaving the country, of emigrating, finding somewhere else to live. The problem, however, was that nobody was prepared to accept any significant numbers of Jews in other countries. No the United States, no Australia, no New Zealand, no South America, and no Great Britain. Jews were basically not allowed, not welcomed anywhere. The result was that Franklin Roosevelt in the United States came under pressure to do something about this. Excuse me. And what he did was he then organized a conference, an international conference at Evian-les-Bains in France on the south shore of Lake Geneva. He invited the major countries of the world to take part in this conference. In fact, 32 countries took part, a whole lot of private organizations, voluntary organizations, and many, many journalists. And the object of the conference basically was to try to find a home for Jewish refugees wanting to flee Nazi persecution in Germany and Austria. They talked for about 3 or 4 days, and they went on talking, and the result was a disaster. Nothing transpired, nothing happened. Nobody was prepared to take in any significant numbers of Jews. Let me just read to you some of the comments made by the delegates. The Australian, for example, said, "We have no racial issues and we don't want to import any." The Frenchman said that they already had too many people living in their country. The delegate from Peru sarcastically pointed out that the United States had already given a fine example of immigration policy. Brazil required a certificate of Christian baptism, and Canada only wanted agricultural workers. So basically what happened, it would have been much, much better had this conference not taken place at all, because there were no communique issued by the conference condemning the Nazis for their persecution of the Jews. In fact, the fact that there was no communique strengthened the Nazis in their resolve. And observers, Nazi observers who were at the conference, went back to Berlin, went back to Hitler and said, You can do what you want with the Jews. Nobody cares. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is basically the background that I wanted to set for my own story. So let me talk to you about this. Oh, before I do that, I just want to also mention that two important people were present at that conference. Golda Meir, the future Prime Minister of Israel, was there as a young woman. She said, "There's only one thing that I hope to see before I die, and that is that my people should not need expressions of sympathy anymore." And Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, said the world seemed to be divided into two parts, where Jews can't live and where Jews can't enter. So it was a really tragic situation. But let me now come to my story. The Kindertransport, children's transport. On the 11th of January, 1939, just over 80 years ago, my parents did an amazingly brave thing. And I've often asked myself whether my wife and I would have had the courage to do what they did. They put me on a train at midnight on the 11th of January, on a train at the Vienna Westbahnhof, the Vienna West station. They put me on a train bound for England. And they had absolutely no idea whether they would ever see me again. Now, can you imagine that situation? Try to put yourselves in the shoes of people like my parents, and there were many, many hundreds who were doing the same thing. So let me tell you a little bit about what they did, why they did it, and what happened to me after that journey. So I was born in Eisenstadt. Now here on this map, on this green area, the green area is the province of Burgenland, which borders Hungary. It's the easternmost province of the country of Austria. It borders Hungary to the east, Slovakia to the north, and Slovenia to the south. And Eisenstadt, as you can see, is fairly far in the north of that particular province. It's the main town of Burgenland. This is a photograph taken in the 1930s. And it is the photograph of the Jewish ghetto in Eisenstadt. And this was a self-imposed ghetto with a chain at each end. And you might ask yourself what the chain is for. Well, the chain was put up on a Friday night, on the eve of the Sabbath, and taken down on the Saturday night after the end of the Sabbath. And the object of the exercise was to prevent vehicles from passing through, to enable the Jews who lived there to mark the Sabbath day in prayer and contemplation and with their families and friends, and not to be interrupted by passing traffic. Now, I was born in that street in May 1930. The ghetto there in Eisenstadt was self-imposed. It was where the Jews actually wanted to live with their co-religionists, where they could observe their Jewish religion, Jewish religious rites in peace and quiet, without interruption. At each end of this street, there is this chain, and today that chain lies there, and you can see on that pillar, the date is 1862, which is when the chain was first introduced to this ghetto in Eisenstadt. So it's a long-standing ghetto. Let me show you some more photographs of that time. So this photo and the following one, this one, are photos of a privately owned synagogue owned by a wealthy wine merchant, Shandor Wolf, and it was not destroyed by the Nazis during Kristallnacht. It was not destroyed because it was small, it was well back from the main area, and it was in among other houses. And the likelihood was that if they tried to burn this place down, other houses would also be damaged. So it was left. And today, it has been restored as a synagogue, but it is not used as a synagogue anymore. It's part of the Jewish Museum of Austria, and there is a very fine branch of the Jewish Museum in Eisenstadt itself. An interesting photo, this one here. It's a photograph which shows a water jug and a water basin. And it indicates that a Levi lived in this house. Now, a Levi is a person who his job is to assist the priest, the Cohen, and during certain ceremonies in the synagogue on certain festival days, the Cohen is required to bless the congregation. But before he does that, he needs to wash his hands. And the Levi is there to help him with that hand washing process. And I find it absolutely fascinating that this bit of architecture, this bit of sculpture over the entrance to this building was still there, possibly 100 years later. And clearly the Nazis had not realized what this was all about, and it was still there. Let me move on. A plaque here in the main street of the ghetto area, which simply says, this is where the synagogue of the Jewish community of Eisenstadt stood before it was destroyed on Kristallnacht in November 1938. My birth certificate. Now, interesting birth certificate. First of all, my name, which you can see here, is shown as Ernst and not Ernest. My name became Ernest when I came to England. It also indicates the word männlich, which means masculine, and underneath that, the letters ISR, Israelitisch, Jewish. Very unusual on a birth certificate in this country, but quite normal in Austria and in Germany in those days. In this country, your religion is not included on your birth certificate. And of course, my father's name, my mother's name, and my father's occupation are all on that particular birth certificate. A photograph of me and a little girl, me on the left, and a couple of little girls at kindergarten. I was probably about 5 years old at that time. And another one, similarly here, there you have me, 5 or 6 years old. And the next photograph is my first school report in 1937, when I was just 7 years old. You'll see from that I was absolutely brilliant. Sehr gut, even for non-German speakers, means very good. So unfortunately, that situation has not continued during my adult life. My first day at school, wearing typical Austrian school wear, another one of me as a youngster. And here we have Esterhazy Palace. Now let me talk to you a little bit about the Esterhazys. Now Eisenstadt, as I said to you earlier, is the capital of the province of Burgenland, and it's also the home of the very well-known Esterhazy family, and a noble family of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they lived there for hundreds of years, basically. This is Esterhazy Palace, or Schloss Esterhazy. And today, this particular building is used by the commune of Eisenstadt. And inside there's also the most beautiful concert hall where concerts, particularly in honor of Joseph Haydn, are played every year. Here we have Joseph Haydn, who worked for the Esterhazys and who lived in Eisenstadt for about 30 years. He's buried in the church in Eisenstadt itself. The Esterhazy family acted as a sort of protector of the Jewish people at a time when Jews were being driven out of major cities such as Vienna, Graz, and Salzburg in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were welcomed in Eisenstadt and in some of the smaller neighboring towns, all of them under the protection of the noble Esterhazy family. And they were welcomed there, and the result was that a very rich Jewish culture developed in those towns, in those small towns. They were known in Hebrew as the Sheva Kehilot, the 7 communities. And these were all communities with a strong Jewish population, not very large, but very active. When my father was born in 1901, the territory of Burgenland belonged to Hungary. And Eisenstadt had a different name, had a Hungarian name called Kismarton. But the Treaty of Versailles, after World War I, changed all that, and the province of Burgenland became part of Austria. Now, the history of the Jews in Eisenstadt goes back several hundred years. It was well known as a place of Jewish learning, and Jews were always an integral part of the community. My own family history, I can trace that back to about 1800, where my great-great-grandfather was Rabbi Yitzchak Tachauer. But on my mother's side, it's a bit more difficult. She was born in Hungary, in what is today Hungary, near Sopron, about 60 kilometers east of Eisenstadt. She was the daughter of the village shoemaker, one of 12 siblings. And she went to work in Austria as a young woman, went to work in Baden by Wien, met my father, and they married in 1928. I was born in 1930. There was no language problem, since Hungarian was widely spoken. My father spoke Hungarian, and my mother very quickly began to speak German. Let me show you one or two more things. Now, this is a photograph of the passports of my aunt and uncle, who both lived in Eisenstadt also. And I'm showing you that simply so that you can see the letter J, which was stamped in red on these passports. This letter J, J for Jew, Jude, made life very difficult for any Jew who tried to leave the country illegally. If a Jew, for example, found his way to a neighboring country like France or Italy or Switzerland, and if they were then picked up by the authorities, who then found this letter J on their passport, they were automatically sent back to their country of origin. So it was really most uncomfortable for these people. The cemetery just outside the ghetto area of Eisenstadt, the Jewish cemetery, there were 2 cemeteries, the old and the new. And my grandparents and my great-grandparents are both buried in this cemetery. It's well cared for by the staff of the Jewish Museum. And it is really an interesting place to go and study some of the grave inscriptions. By the middle of the 19th century, there were some 4,000 Jews living in Vienna, less than 1% of the population. By 1900, however, the Jewish population of Vienna had increased to about 150,000, which was about 9% of the population, an extremely rapid increase. 20 years later, by 1923, the number of Jews in Vienna were about 200,000, some 11% of the population. The social situation of the Jews in the country gradually improved, and by this time, by the 1930s, Jews were among the leaders in intellectual, in commercial, in social life. However, as you might imagine, there was a very strong undercurrent of anti-Semitism at this time. And so it was not surprising that when the Germans entered Austria, when the German Anschluss of Austria came in March 1938, the Germans were in fact welcomed by a significant number of Austrians. Now, the word Anschluss doesn't mean invasion, it means a joining together. And, you know, this really was something which was welcomed by many, many Austrians. Now, suddenly, everything changed for us. The Nazis' objective in arriving in Austria was to rid Austria of Jews. That was their main objective at that time. And we, together with the entire Jewish population of Eisenstadt, and in fact, the entire Jewish population of Burgenland, we were forced to quit Eisenstadt in September 1938, leaving behind everything, our home, our belongings, most of our property. This was ethnic cleansing to a degree. Well, we moved to Vienna, and luckily my father managed to find a small flat in this building that you can see on the screen, on the second floor of this building. So we went to live there, and during this time he immediately started to try to find exit visas to leave the country. But as I explained to you right at the beginning of this talk, very few countries, in fact no countries, were prepared to accept any Jews. In fact, if you were very wealthy, of course you were welcome, but the average Jew was not very wealthy, and he simply was not acceptable in most countries. So my father struggled. He applied for a visa at the American embassy, at the British embassy, at the embassy of the state of Palestine. His idea was that whichever visa came first, whichever permit came first, that's the one that we would go to. But unfortunately, nothing came. And then he was imprisoned. We don't know why he was imprisoned. He was not politically active in anything, in any way. He was a junior manager in a shoe factory, and that was his life, basically. So luckily, he was released after a few weeks, and he continued his efforts to try to find an exit visa. But then suddenly, on the 9th of November, 1938, came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. I'm sure that you've all heard of this, the November pogrom. This was an orchestrated attack by Nazis on Jewish property in Germany and Austria. Synagogues and other Jewish buildings and shops were attacked, ransacked, pillaged, burnt. 91 Jews were murdered during these 2 days. We lived in a street with a synagogue on the second floor of this building, as you can see. And I distinctly remember the bonfire below my window on the night of the 9th of November, a bonfire made up of prayer books and Torah scrolls taken from the local synagogue, and the Nazis wandering around, enjoying themselves and finding Jews to beat up. This was their life. Luckily, my mother had been warned by the concierge of this building that we should be careful and to stay indoors on that particular day. The concierge clearly knew what was about to happen. Now, the pretext for the attacks on Kristallnacht and on those 2 days was, in fact, the assassination in Paris of a German diplomat called Ernst von Rath. He was killed by a young Polish Jew, Herschel Greenspan, whose parents had been very badly treated by the Nazis. And this young man wanted his revenge. And his idea of revenge was to walk into a shop in Paris, buy himself a gun, then walk into the German embassy and kill a German diplomat. That was his idea. And the Nazis used this as a pretext for the Kristallnacht events. Now, we know that this was a pretext. We know also that everything had been very carefully planned in advance, because the police and the fire brigades throughout Germany and Austria had been given very clear instructions not to interfere with what was about to happen. However, they say that every cloud has a silver lining, and the events of Kristallnacht acted as a catalyst in certain quarters of the United Kingdom. And the concept of the Kindertransport was formed. So let me try to tell you what this is all about. A few days after Kristallnacht, on the 15th of November, a delegation of British Jewish leaders appealed in person to the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. This, by the way, is an example of what we saw in those days. And here is a result of what happened. Kristallnacht, 7,500 businesses destroyed, 267 synagogues burned, and 177 totally destroyed. And as I said earlier, 91 Jews murdered. So this delegation of Jews appealed in person to Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister, asking that the government should allow the temporary admission of Jewish children from Germany and Austria for educational purposes and to try to save their lives, and that these children would later re-emigrate. Chamberlain turned down this delegation. He said, "Hitler is a man with whom I can do a deal." Luckily, a few days later, a group of influential Quakers went to see the Prime Minister. This was Sir Samuel Hoare, the Home Secretary, together with Philip Noel Baker, another Quaker. And this time, they succeeded in persuading Chamberlain to change his mind. The whole subject was then debated in the cabinet and subsequently in the House of Commons. And it was agreed that the country would accept the immigration of unaccompanied children between the ages of 3 and 17. And then, strangely enough, no upper limit was ever set on the number of refugees who might be allowed into this country. Now, the Quakers were very important in all this. They influenced the Prime Minister They made the plan work at railway stations in Germany and Austria. They were at the Hook of Holland, getting the children onto the boats. And they were at Liverpool Street Station, making sure that there was somebody there to meet and to greet each child. And very importantly, at that time, the government wanted a guarantee for each child, a guarantee of £50 per person. Now, £50 in 1938-39 was a lot of money, something like £2,500 or £3,000 in today's money. And the Quakers quietly paid guarantees for 7,000 children. An amazing feat, an amazing action. So the rescue operation basically worked. They came to this country, most of and they lived and they survived. However, only a small percentage ever saw their parents again. Their parents had basically been murdered as part of the Nazi Holocaust. The majority of these children lost their parents, they lost their homes, and they never saw their families again. The end of the war brought confirmation of the worst. Their parents were dead. And in the period since the children had left the European mainland, the Nazis and their collaborators had killed about 6 million European Jews, and of this 6 million, 1.5 million were children. So the 10,000 whose lives were saved have an awful lot to be thankful for. Now, questions were clearly asked why more could not have been done by major countries of the world, such as United States, Australia, Canada, even Britain. Britain had very strict rules on immigration at that time. These countries were all closed to continental Jews who were unable to support themselves. However, as I said, 10,000 children came, and 10,000 children have a lot to be thankful for and are very grateful to this country for receiving them. You may have heard of the family of Richard and David Attenborough, who took in 2 girls from the Kindertransport, girls who lived with them as part of the family for many years and grew up as siblings. Here you have an example of the sort of children and the labels that they had. My number, by the way, was 226. This is my permit to arrive in Harwich. It gives my name, a small picture, my date of birth, and so on and so forth. And on the back side of that little card is the date 13th of January. Now, I know that I left on the 11th of January, so that journey from Vienna to Harwich obviously took something like 30 hours, 1.5 days, because the date is shown as 2 days later. Here you have a statue outside Liverpool Street Station. Now, this is a very famous statue produced by an Israeli sculptor called Fritz Meisler. And this is one of 4 statues of this type. They're not identical, but they're very similar. There's one here at Liverpool Street Station. There's another one in Danzig in Poland, which is where Meisler came from. He himself came on the Kindertransport as a young man. Another one is in Berlin. And the 4th is at the Hook of Holland. And what happened was, to mark, I think it was the 70th anniversary of the Kindertransport, there was a ceremonial unveiling of the statue at the Hook of Holland. My wife and I went there for this ceremony, and this Dutch newspaper headline is "Forever Thankful the Kindertransport monument unveiled. Here we have a photograph of my family. This is after our arrival in England. What I haven't yet told you is that my younger brother, Kurt, stayed behind with my parents. But luckily, my parents were able to obtain a domestic service visa, which enabled them to come to this country some few weeks after my arrival. So they went to work for two doctors living just outside Leeds. And they worked, my mother as cook, my father as general handyman. And I went to live with a very kind Jewish family in Leeds, who took me in as a foster child and who looked after me, because of course I couldn't live with my parents. They were working as domestic servants. And my brother lived nearby with other foster parents, quite near to me. Now, I distinctly remember my first day at school in Leeds, Cowper Street School, where I went as a young 8-year-old, wearing typical Austrian schoolwear, knickerbockers or +4s, which was what was worn in the cold winter weather. Clearly, then that made me very much the center of attraction among my school fellows in Leeds, at Cowper Street School, because of course I didn't speak a word of English. And of course, luckily, one of the teachers was Jewish, who spoke some Yiddish. Now, Yiddish is very similar, not very similar, but has some resemblance to German. And he and I managed to make ourselves understood, so that at least in the early stages, he was my help. But children learn a language very quickly, and within a matter of weeks, I was speaking enough English to get by and carry on with my newfound friends. At the outbreak of war in September 1939, I was evacuated to a village, small village in Lincolnshire. At that time, as you probably know, all children in the major cities of this country were evacuated to the countryside to try to escape any potential German bombing. And I lived with a farming family who didn't speak a word of German. So my English improved very rapidly. However, my German got rather poor. I began to lose vocabulary. So when my parents came to visit me in Lincolnshire after about 3 months' stay there, the situation was that they spoke to me in German, which I understood perfectly well, and I replied in English, which my mother did not understand. And she got extremely upset. She burst into tears and more or less insisted that I should come back to Leeds, back to civilization as quickly as possible. And that indeed is what happened. So I went back to Leeds, but this time I didn't live with the foster parents any longer, but by this time, the Jewish community of Leeds had set up a hostel for young immigrants, Jewish immigrants, like myself and like my brother. And so my brother and I went to live in this hostel in Steinbeck Lane in Leeds, and we were the youngest of a group of about 40 or 50 young children who were looked after in this hostel. At this time also, in early 1940, my father, along with all other German and Austrian refugees, my father was interned to the Isle of Man. I don't know how many of you realize that many thousands of refugees were interned. Some were sent to the Isle of Man, that was the main destination, but some were sent also to Canada, others to Australia. And The ones on the Isle of Man were treated reasonably well. My father didn't complain about the treatment, but of course he complained about the fact that he wasn't with his family. However, after about a year, the government realized that they'd probably made a mistake, that most of the people whom they'd interned there were Jews who had more reason to hate the Nazis than the average Englishman. And there were German-speaking Jews who probably could be of great help to them in the war effort against the Germans. So they were allowed to come back, and many of them joined the army. Others went into war work. My father went into war work in Leeds, near Leeds, and by about 1941, we were then living together as a family for the first time. I don't know how my parents managed to cobble enough money together to either to rent or to buy a small house in Shepherd's Lane in Leeds, but that's what they did. So by 1941, for the first time in a couple of years, we lived together once again as a family. And the time now came, 1941, for me to take my entrance examination to get me to a grammar school for my further education. Well, unfortunately, the 11+ examination was too much for me. I failed that. However, in those days, one could pay. And so the school in North Leeds, it was Roundhay School, they wanted £15 a term for me. Now, that £15 a term in 1941 was a lot of money for my father. However, in South Leeds, Cockburn High School wanted only £5 a term. So that's where I went. And for the next 6 years, I found myself traveling from North Leeds, which is where we lived, to South Leeds, to Cockburn High School, through the center of Leeds every day during school days, either on the bus or tram, or as I grew older, on a bicycle. So that's where I went. Now, by this time, by 1942 also, my brother and I were already very typical English schoolboys. We didn't have very typical English parents. The language system at home was, my parents would speak to us in German and we would reply in English. And this seemed to work quite well. And if they wanted to say something to each other, which they didn't want my brother and me to understand, then they would speak Hungarian, which, as you can imagine, is a very complicated language. So our education went quite smoothly. He went to a central high school in Leeds, and we both went on to Leeds University. I studied economics and subsequently went into business. My brother studied medicine. He became a doctor and later a consultant anesthetist. Now, just one final item before we go on. Here we have the Cockburn High School first 11 football team in 1948. And I can't give you any prizes. Normally when I speak in a school, I would be offered a prize to anyone who can find me on there. So I leave you with the thought of who can find me on there, and I'm not going to tell you. This is a thought which you can have. All you have to do is to find the most handsome person on that photograph. It's quite easy, really. So one more item of interest before I close. During the last 3 years of my 33-year career with ICI, I was the general manager of the ICI business in Hungary during the period 1987 to 1990. This was the last 3 years of the Soviet regime. Hungary was one of the East Bloc countries of the Soviet regime. Now, Hungary was certainly the easiest of these Iron Curtain countries for an expatriate like myself. But nevertheless, we knew that we were being watched. We knew that our phones were being bugged at home, in the office, in the car, and that the authorities were well aware of our movements. So every few weeks, we would drive to Austria, spend some time in the ICI office in Vienna, arranging meetings which might be of a sensitive nature if the Hungarians discovered about it, or arranging telephone calls of a similar nature. Another major feature of these trips to Austria, of course, was shopping, particularly important for my wife. Now, there were many things that were available in Hungary which were not available in other Eastern European countries, but still it was far, far worse than living in the West, and this is what we had become accustomed to. So we enjoyed the shopping trips every few weeks, and we would stuff the boot of our car and then stuff the 2 freezers that we had back in Budapest. And very often we would shop in the supermarket in Eisenstadt, because that was near the border and because it was a very good supermarket full of the sort of things that we wanted. And often I would stand there and think to myself, what might have happened to me had there been no Kindertransport? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my story. Thank you very much indeed.